Chapter 5, The Engine of Evolution. To understand evolution, we must look deeper within the core processes that drive evolution. One of these processes is natural selection. Natural selection changes the genetic composition of an individual to increase the number of genes that amplify the survival and reproduction rate. But how? There are 3 standards that must be met for an adaptation to be evolved by natural selection. First, the population should have a variation of that trait for it to evolve. Second, the variation of that trait needs to be within the gene. In other words, the trait must be heritable so that it can be passed from generation to generation. The third requirement is that genetic variation must be able to affect the probability of an individual reproducing offspring. But what does this look like in animals? In an experiment performed by Donald Kaufman at Kansas State University, light coat-colored mice and dark coat-colored mice were placed into a cage that had both light and dark soil. Kaufman then placed an owl into the cage and waited to see which mice survived against the owl. The results concluded in wild mice surviving when their coat color matched the color of the soil they lived in. So, does coat color in mice meet the criteria to be considered an adaptation from natural selection? In mice population, there is a variation of coat color from light to dark. The coat color is heritable since 2 known genes have control over the effect of light/dark coat color difference. Genetic variation in coat color has an influence on wild mice reproducing offspring. For example, the white coat color of beach mice help them camouflage with white sand. Therefore, they can hide against predators and be alive to reproduce. Using coat color to disguise against predators may seem simple enough, but adaptation from natural selection can get complex when it comes to finding food or finding a mate to reproduce with. To feed their larvae, the Asian giant hornet resort to invading the nests of European honeybees and eat their honey. The hornets invade the bees by sending out a lone hornet to find a beehive, and mark it by placing a drop of pheromone at the entrance of the beehive. The rest of the hornets come swarming in the hive and decapitate the bees until they have eliminated the whole bee colony. On the other hand, Japanese honeybees have developed a defense response towards the constant attack from the Asian giant hornet. When the lone hornet approaches the hive of the Japanese honeybees, the honeybees surround the hornet in a tight ball and vibrate their abdomen to raise the temperature of the ball to 117 degrees Fahrenheit, ultimately heating the hornet to death. Within each group of insect, there lays an adaptation to their environment or absence of an adaptation. The Asian giant hornet have adopted various traits that make them skilled killers. Physically, their body is 2 inches, their stingers are long, and they have sharp jaws that can dominate their prey. Chemically, they make marking pheromones and venom in their stingers. The behavior of the hornet larvae, being hungry, drives the hornets to attack for food. The Japanese honeybees evolved a technique towards the constant attack of hornets involving a coordinated swarming and heating their intruders to death. Since European honeybees live in an area without giant hornets, natural selection has not developed a defense. But if hornets became predominant predators in the European honeybees' territory, the honeybees will either die off or build their own evolutionary defense response. These adaptations from natural selection must help an individual survive and increase their probability of reproduction. Adaptations must also increase the fitness of the individual, not the group. Since natural selection modifies old traits into newly evolved traits, the theory of natural selection must explain the evolution of how adaptations evolve on a physical and molecular level. Natural selection should be able to trace a trait's evolution step by step. In theory, natural selection is a process when organisms best suited in their environments have better chances at survival and reproduction. Another process of evolution that coincides with natural selection is mutations. Mutations help natural selection in creating new traits that can be beneficial to an individual. Mutations create new traits since they are DNA replication errors. They can be beneficial, neutral, or harmful. Mutations happen no matter if they are useful or not to an individual. There is no known biological way to increase the probability of a mutation occurring.
Evolution without selection. Natural selection isn't the only process of evolutionary change. Most biologists define evolution as a change in the proportion of alleles in a population. Genetic drift causes random change in the frequency of genes over time. These changes do not arise from natural selection, but instead random chance. With the above definitions in mind, it would stand to reason that genetic drift is a mechanism of evolution. Every individual has two copies of a gene, which can be different or the same. In sexual reproduction, only one of the pair is passed down from each parent. Because the number of offsprings are finite, the frequency of the genes present in the offspring will not be the same as the frequencies present in the parents. This sampling of genes leads to changes in proportion of alleles over time, entirely by chance, with small populations being affected more strongly. New mutations can arise and either rise or fall in frequency because of the random sampling. Eventually, genes can be fixed or lost by this method. Genetic drift can change allele frequencies regardless of how useful or harmful the genes are to the carrier. However, genetic drift is limited by the fact that it cannot cause the evolution of adaptations. It would never be able to build a wing or an eye. What it can do is cause the evolution of features that are selectively neutral to the organism. This means that these features do not alter the fitness. Mutations that don't affect the function of a protein are liable to evolve by genetic drift. In addition, mutations in genes that cause no change in fitness can only be changed by genetic drift. It is possible that we can attribute many externally visible features to genetic drift, as long as those features didn't affect reproduction. Genetic drift can also work against the forces of natural selection. In small populations, the sampling effect can be so strong that it raises the frequency of harmful alleles, even though selection is working in the opposite direction. This explains why a high incidence of genetic diseases can be found in isolated human communities such as Gaucher's disease in northern Swedes and Tay-Sachs in the Cajuns of Louisiana. Genetic drift must occur. Any population of finite size will always have sampling effects during reproduction, and thus will always be affected by genetic drift. Many people want evidence for evolution that can be seen in a short time frame for them to believe it true. One good evidence is artificial selection. Farmers and breeders have transformed organisms to forms that are better to eat or for pure aesthetics. This is done by strongly selecting for variation that was present in the wild ancestors. This has led to huge changes in a relatively short time frame, since animal and plant breeding has only been around for a few thousand years. The great diversity of dog breeds is a perfect example of artificial selection. All the different breeds and varieties came from a single ancestral species, from the tiny Chihuahua to the bulky Mastiff. Wild dogs cannot be found with many of the different traits that can be seen in domestic dog breeds, evidencing the impact artificial selection has had on dog evolution. This level of success in dog breeding proves two requirements for evolution by selection: that there was enough variation in multiple traits in the ancestral lineage to allow the creation of this many breeds, and some of the variation was a result of genetic mutation that was heritable. So what makes artificial selection different from natural selection? In artificial selection, it is the breeder instead of nature that chooses what variants are good or bad. This means that reproductive success is dependent on human desire instead of adaptation to a natural environment. Sometimes, the selective pressures from both artificial and natural selection can coincide. Take for example the greyhound. This type of dog was bred for speed and wound up being shaped like a cheetah. This is an example of how convergent evolution shows similar pressures lead to similar outcome. On the left, we see the greyhound. With artificial selection, we were able to select for dogs with greater speed. On the right, we see the cheetah. Nature selected for faster cheetahs because those cheetahs were able to catch the quick gazelles. Because microbes like bacteria have such a short generation time, we are able to artificially create environments to observe natural selection. E. coli, for example, may divide once every 20 minutes. This allows us to observe thousands of generations in real time. Because we don't get to choose which individuals get to reproduce, we get to see the differential survival and reproduction of variants due to natural selection, something we couldn't do with breeding. Microbes are very good at adapting to almost anything thrown at them. Thanks to this, we can test for simple adaptations by introducing them to new environments. One of the longest-running studies of this type was carried out at Michigan State University by Richard Lenski. Lenski placed a strain of E. coli under conditions where their main food source was depleted each day and renewed the next. They were presented in an environment where feast or famine was an everyday thing. Over the next 18 years, the bacteria accumulated new adaptations that helped them thrive in the new environment. They now grow 70% faster than the original strain. Microbes are even capable of far more complex adaptations, being able to evolve new biochemical systems to adapt. In an experiment done by Barry Hall at the University of Rochester, they tested E. coli's ability to adapt by removing a gene responsible for an enzyme that allows digestion of lactose. They were then placed in an environment where lactose is the only food source. After only a short time, the bacteria were able to break down lactose weakly with another enzyme thanks to a new mutation. The bacteria later then developed another mutation that increased the amount of the new enzyme produced so that they could use more lactose. Finally, another mutation in a different gene allowed the bacteria to take in the lactose more easily. The bacteria were able to evolve a new complex biochemical pathway that allowed them to thrive off of a previously unusable food source. Not only does this demonstrate evolution, but it also shows how natural selection can lead to complex systems in which all parts are codependent, something that creationists claim as impossible. Secondly, we also see how natural selection produces new adaptations by modifying pre-existing features, rather than from scratch. We can also demonstrate speciation with experiments on microbes. Paul Rainey performed an experiment where he placed a strain of bacteria in a small container holding only nutrient broth. The oxygen concentration is highest at the top and lowest at the bottom of the vessel, resulting in 3 different ecosystems. Within 10 days, the ancestral free-floating bacteria had evolved into 2 additional forms occupying different parts. Each of the 2 new forms were genetically different from the ancestor, with one of them occupying the top part and the other occupying the bottom. With the introduction of antibiotics, people hoped that it would finally solve the issue of infectious disease caused by bacteria. Because bacteria have huge population sizes and short generation times, they have a really high chance of mutation causing antibiotic resistance to arise. The offspring with this mutation will be selected for, and eventually we're left with a strain of bacteria resistant to antibiotics. The decreased effectiveness of penicillin is a great example of the evolution of drug-resistant bacteria. In 1941, penicillin was able to wipe out every strain of staph. Now more than 95% are resistant. Even viruses are able to evolve resistances to antivirals. AZT, for example, used to be effective in preventing HIV virus from replicating. The evolution of resistance isn't exclusive to microbes. Insects, plants, and worms, among many other organisms, have all developed resistances to toxins introduced to the environment by humans. We can then infer that when a population is introduced to stress from nature, natural selection will lead to an adaptive response in order to survive.
Natural selection in the wild is slow. To be able to see natural selection, it must be strong selection that can cause rapid change and also be best to observe species with short generation times. However, even if we do see natural selection, we see microevolutionary change, small changes, and not macroevolutionary change, large changes that transforms types of species. The type of selection likely seen is stabilizing selection, where from generation to the next there isn't much change, but outlier genes are eliminated. A good way of seeing selection in the wild is observing species with short generation times and that are adapting to a changing environment. An example of this are medium ground finches. On the island of Daphne Major, there was a severe drought that limited the food supply for the medium ground finches. The finches had to switch to large hard seeds. Big-beaked finches got food easily, while small-beaked finches suffered from malnutrition because they couldn't eat the seeds. The big-beaked survivors thrived and had more offspring. By the next generation, they dominated the gene pool. This caused the average beak size and body size to increase. In the finch's case, the ability to gather, eat, and digest food for survival is a strong selective force. In the case of soapberry bugs, we see evolutionary switches equal to living in a different habitat that is accompanied by strong selection. Soapberry bugs have long needle-like beaks used to penetrate fruit and eat the seeds inside of it. These bugs live in different areas with different sizes of fruits. Natural selection then changes size of the beaks. Large fruited species evolved larger beaks, and small fruited species evolved smaller beaks. Natural selection plays a role in how plants adapt to their environment. When there are prolonged droughts, natural selection leads to evolution of plants to flower earlier than their ancestors. If plants don't flower quickly in droughts, they won't be able to leave offspring. The example of the wild mustard plants shows that weather and environment conditions are strong selection forces. The origin of adaptations involve natural selection. Complex biochemical pathways are built up in an adaptive way from simpler pathways. An example of this is the process of blood clotting. In clotting, proteins stick together, setting off a cascade of multiple reactions that involve various other proteins. Proteins that play a role in clotting in vertebrates can be seen as ancestral proteins in invertebrates. These proteins were evolutionarily co-opted and functioned differently. Some of the mechanisms of evolution are natural selection, genetic drift, and mutations. Natural selection in the lab and in the wild molds adaptations that lead to complex changes in features. Genetic drift causes change in allele frequencies by pure chance and can also work with or against natural selection. Mutations are DNA replication errors and occur whether or not they are useful.